Hi, hello, and welcome back to the HII Method. My name is Jen Hatz. I am the host of the HII Method podcast and also the founder of the HII Method, a holistic, integrative, and innovative approach to assessing and optimizing human health, well-being, and performance. And I'm partnered with Neuroforce One, a human performance company that has been training champions for years, and they offer training and assessments in their facility as well as remote options available. And I just had a very fun episode. I think the last episode was fun for me, talking about the Tale of Two Cities and really just that old school mentality versus new school mentality. But I think the fun part for me is the fact that it helps me to try to explain the way that I view things, that I view things in that exact position of identifying this old school, new school mentality, that I kind of go rogue. Not even kind of, I definitely go rogue. I am rogue. So I kind of tend to stand on my own island, viewing things from like a detached perspective, which is totally fine with me. I'll be the queen of detachment if that's an award, I'll take it. But so being in like that island and viewing things from this different perspective, I think has allowed me, if anything, to be able to not only question these things and continue to find ways that maybe we need to expand something that we thought we knew and we need to learn more about it, or to find connections from things, from one thing to another, and try to, just continue to, if anything, find a way to be creative and connect the dots and ask questions, and doing so in a way because I'm not so heavily, focused and saturated by one camp, if that makes sense. I'm sitting on the outside looking at everyone and finding ways to connect all the dots. Otherwise, if you're in the mix and you're like stuck in that camp and saturated with being told the same thing over and over, it's very hard to break out of that. It's just an echo chamber. And so I like that I take that rogue kind of perspective and just being a little individual on my own island. But that kind of helps to lead into the second part of this story. So even though I called it the Tale of Two Cities, it's really the Tale of Two Episodes, right? So last episode, we were talking more about gut health and how there was this previous, well, really, it's still very much rampant, this outdated perspective on how sports nutrition plays a role for individuals, but specifically with this I think, contrasting perspectives or contrasting guidelines between when and what types of these carbohydrates and sugars to take in versus when your body is actually receptive to them or when it could be problematic. And this is like this contrasting kind of, it's if anything, like a dance between what has been in the field of how these recommendations are given and why these recommendations are given, versus what I like to think of as this newer approach where you're identifying that, hey, maybe there's actually a whole lot more benefit from making different choices and maybe not following along with the standard. So what I mean by that, if that sounds a little out there, I mean, like I said, I'm pretty rogue, pretty individualistic. But so that contrast of those carbohydrate recommendations being given to athletes. And so a lot of the work that I've done was, even though in the last episode I talked about an endurance athlete, an ultra endurance athlete, besides that, a lot of the work I've done has been in collision sports, specifically in football. And there is a very large, I think, a very large contrast in where our priorities should be placed when it comes to taking care of the athletes in a collision sport. And so this was where my rogue ways definitely stood out. I tended to stand out against all of the other dietitians that were working just with collegiate athletes in general, let alone football. And it was because I viewed not only that distinction of the difference in carbohydrates and like when is really an appropriate time to be taking in carbohydrates, especially sugars, versus when is it more problematic. And I viewed that within the context of this population specifically, of these athletes engaging in a collision sport. This is not a contact sport, it's a collision sport. And the reality is, I saw enough evidence from me asking these questions and questioning what I've been told and taught and questioning what has been told and taught, and identifying that there's enough evidence to say otherwise. There's more than enough evidence to say that those recommendations are not helpful. They may actually be harmful. And so I was very rogue in taking a step, taking a lot of action on changing that in real time with my athletes and not waiting until research catches up, because that could be 20 years from now before we actually have enough quote unquote research to back up making changes and recommendations. So I was very much like boots on the ground rogue, making changes, making sure that my athletes are taken care of appropriately, knowing that there's enough evidence to support a reason to make these changes. And so it was interesting because me being this rogue practitioner, if you will, the rogue, I just like saying that name, rogue. But so I would have very challenging conversations with other dietitians, other sports dietitians. And it wasn't that it was a challenging conversation for me to have, it was that I was being challenged. And so these conversations were very often me having to really just support and provide rationale for changes that I was making. And a lot of times I felt very heavily like I was being met with resistance because of the fact that it was changes that I was making. Not necessarily that they were, what I was doing was making changes for the better, to help the athletes and to help their health. But it was the fact that I was changing and making changes that went against the grain of what everyone said and did and was taught. That was where the resistance was coming from, that others didn't want to accept really what I was doing and why I was doing it. And so I had to constantly provide this support for my decisions and some rationale behind, hey, there's a better way to go about this, and we have enough reason to believe that this is the route we need to go, and we need to do so immediately. And so some of the conversations that I had, some of the actions that I took, first of all, was knowing that there was this very clear, distinct difference between when and where and what types of carbohydrates someone should be taking in to promote their health versus the opposite, when and where and what types and how much carbohydrates can be problematic for your overall health. So I started addressing the total carbohydrates and the types of carbohydrates that were being provided across the board. I didn't want my athletes to be operating in a state where they were taking in continually on a routine lifestyle basis a high amount of these added sugars. And instead, I wanted their carbohydrates to be whole food forms where there was fiber, because that fiber is it is the silent hero, really. Like there's such a body of evidence that needs to be conducted and finally put out on how important fiber is in differentiating carbohydrates that are beneficial for you versus not. And I think that has been missing from the conversation for far too long. But so I was making a lot of changes on not just what these athletes were taking in from a food perspective, but then addressing and adjusting what they're taking in from fluids. Because like I said with that story about the endurance athlete who was taking in a lot of carbohydrates when he was exercising, it's all sports nutrition products, fluids and gels and chews and all this quick digesting sugars. Now, here's the thing. Anyone who's seen an ad for a sports drink like Gatorade, you identify it as being this athletic beverage. For whatever reason, the marketing has been cast out that this is something that you need to have if you're an athlete, that's replacing what you've lost. And especially they try to zero in on sweat, that it's replacing what you've lost through sweat. None of that is actually accurate. It's replacing sugar. Well, so it's providing sugar. So it's going to help replace some muscle glycogen that you have used. And more than likely, it's going to replace liver glycogen before muscle glycogen because of the fact that it is a simple sugar that is in a fluid form. So you're going to digest it very rapidly. And when you digest and absorb sugar in a liquid form very rapidly, it's going to increase your blood glucose. So that's going to go right to your liver right away and basically fill up your liver glycogen first. So it's really impacting your blood glucose circulations and your liver. And then you might have a spillover effect of increasing your muscle glycogen. But the reality is this timing, the whole concept around when to use it and why it would be beneficial, I think has been it's been misconstrued. I think it's been overblown, first of all. But I think it's been misunderstood in what it is and the fact that it's actually beneficial. Because I think pretty much every single athlete would probably benefit from not having it and would have much more improved health and optimized performance if they went a different route and chose different foods in total throughout the day, a different lifestyle really in total throughout the day. So foods and fluids and sleep and properly addressing the training versus rest types of intervals, how much training they're having versus actual rest or recovery days. So there are far too many other areas that can help to promote health and functioning and performance besides trying to push sugar into people. So I took a very, very radical, step of action, really just continually taking radical steps of action. I was just a rogue radical person. So still am today. But so as I was making these changes on what these athletes were taking in, and I kept getting hit with a lot of resistance from, like I said, other sports dietitians, and specifically dietitians that I worked with at the same organization, because what they're preaching to their athletes is different from what I'm preaching to my athletes, right? So of course we have these challenging conversations. And what I was really zeroing in on, knowing that my population is football, that these are individuals who are experiencing very different circumstances on a day-to-day basis from others. That's just the reality of it. And so I was very heavily focused on trying to identify not just this change in overall lifestyle, but the fact that changing overall lifestyle factors has a very close link to addressing not only mental health in general, but also neurodegeneration and potentially CTE, and seeing if this is a factor in concussion protocols and in applying something to concussion protocols. So everything related to the brain, basically, and how your brain functions, the structure and function of your brain, to seeing how and in what ways your lifestyle factors are going to impact that. That was my priority. That still is like my priority, and that is continuing to be my priority as I continue on for the PhD route. It is that specific combination, and I'll get to that in a second. But so because that was my priority, I was deprioritizing trying to push Gatorade. So I'll just say that as like a broad scale statement, that I was deprioritizing pushing Gatorade because I was prioritizing the brain and mental health and neurodegeneration and cognitive functioning. So I had very specific priorities, and that meant that my choices were going to align with where those priorities were. And I was looking at what is best for these athletes. And so if anything, there was one conversation that really stood out to me, and it was because I was being challenged once again about my decision to not push and really not have Gatorade anywhere specifically, especially on the sidelines during games and during really anytime that the athletes were on the field. There's no need for them to be pushed Gatorade, like absolutely not. There are other times that we can allow for more simple sugars to be allowable, but this is not the time, and that's not the type. I don't want liquid carbohydrates in these athletes, not during this time. And I'll explain to that in a second. But so because I was getting met with resistance, the remark that this dietitian made to me, it's still to this day stands out to me. She said, because I was explaining that my priority is their brain health. And she said, well, I don't care about their brain health. I care much more about their muscle glycogen. And the way that it was stated, and I was fired up at that point in time, I think my response was probably not the greatest. I think I said something like, ooh, wrong thing to say to me, and that's why you will never have access to my athletes. Like, I was mad. I was like a mad mama bear hearing that, because that to me felt like such a strong disconnect, first of all, but it felt, man, I felt enraged hearing that, because to deprioritize someone's brain health in order to reprioritize instead this thing that doesn't actually make sense in the equation, it just takes me back to this entire topic of how important it is to sit back and to question something and not just blindly accept what we're being told or sold or anything, you know? So in this case, she was making a statement. I mean, I don't think she truly meant that full statement. It was just in the moment kind of a thing, but man, it hit me hard to hear that. And it still, like I said, hits me hard. But I believe that what she was intending to say at that point in time was in some way to support the curriculum that she went through and what she was taught and what she was tested on and what she is now recommending to her athletes and what she is promoting and teaching to interns who are now working. And so this entire time that we were having this kind of conflict of perspectives and really just challenging conversations, it was at the time really discouraging for me to see that this is someone who has, viewing her position, I'm like, she has access to hundreds, if not thousands of athletes. And she's also training interns who are also going to have access to hundreds of thousands of athletes. So my perspective was really, I was angry. I felt very angry that someone's in a position to have a really massive influence and impact over others. And if they're not acknowledging in real time the weight of their decisions, the weight of their words, what it is that they're saying and what the true impact could be from that. And so I think if anything, that situation happening, really just the series of challenging conversations that I had being this rogue person, it's continued to feed me with this like undying urge to do what I'm doing and to continue to promote changes, really, to continue to promote questioning and curiosity and making changes. And so I'm actually going to address, I guess, like the whole function for this podcast really is that I want this to be really the nice middle ground or the medium where as I'm continuing to go down the research route and actually conducting research and it's stuff that it's industry research, but it's also real life application. And so my goal is that as I'm continuing to learn and discover and identify these things, that I have this immediate medium to be able to put this out into the world so that we can start to make these potential changes and adjustments in real time and not wait for, like I said, research to catch up when it could be 20 years from now when there's enough academic research in order to make some broad scale changes and recommendations. I think it's a more effective, more necessary approach to view what we can do from an industry research standpoint and be able to turn that around immediately and apply it. So my goal for this podcast is that this is the medium for that real life application as immediately as possible, synced up with these research findings as we're going. So hopefully someone leave a comment that this is like helping to bridge some gaps and that you're getting some new perspectives on things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have seen, because research in academia is its own thing. Really, it ends up being research for the sake of research, not necessarily for the sake of real life application. So that's where we're going with this podcast. So, so I want to go back to what I was saying about how my priority for these athletes was specific around brain health. And so that might seem like a very obvious statement to make, but it also, for me, it mirrored on personal and professional, really a moral obligation, personally and professionally, in order to approach what is changes in mental health, changes in cognitive functioning, changes in neurodegenerative diseases and neurological diseases, and anything related to the structure and function of your brain and how your brain works. And it's not just the brain as an organ, but it's also your mind, which is your actual experience. That's what makes you a human being. That's your personality. That's how you experience life, how you view life, how you view yourself. So this contrast, the combination really of your brain and your mind, and viewing this through this lens of how is it that lifestyle factors play a role. I know that they play a role. We all know that they play a role, but in what ways do they play a role? And are some maybe more susceptible to certain changes in their lifestyle than others with having an impact on their brain? And so the reason why I got so, I think, heavily focused down this route, and really just, I never really understood why. For the longest time, I felt like I was drawn towards football specifically, and I didn't have a solid reason why, other than the fact that there was something there's something in this population that I need to work with and experience in real time. There's something about the real life application of working with these athletes that is necessary for me to understand this link between brain health and lifestyle factors. And I couldn't otherwise put that in words at the time. Everyone's like, why do you want to work in football? Like you're never played football. Why do you want to work in football? And so it's like hard to put into words, but I'm like, at the time I was like, I feel like I need to be here right now. I feel like I need to experience this real life application to understand this connection between these things. And so something that triggered me right at the beginning of my it was right before I was starting to intern actually in football. Right around that time was when that movie Concussion came out. And so that triggered in my mind something immediately that I had been continuing to follow. And it was the fact that, so the movie, first of all, the title of the movie, Concussion, and the movie itself is, tying football and collisions in football with CTE. So immediately coming out of that movie, it triggered in my mind the interest in that topic entirely. But I also had a thought right away that came to mind, and I didn't know why I had this thought, but I knew I had to follow that thought. And the thought was, CTE is a metabolic disorder. So like I said, coming out of that movie, and even just the title of the movie, Concussion, makes this broad scale view that CTE is a concussion disorder. And in my mind, immediately, I said, no, CTE is a metabolic disorder. And I didn't know why I had that thought, but I had that thought. So I continued down that route of understanding and researching why I had that thought. So what I was learning through the research findings that I was able to come to and find, plus real life application. And the reason why I give that combination of research that is available and real life application is because CTE is not diagnostic. There are no diagnostic criteria for CTE during life. It's postpartum, not postpartum. That's after pregnancy. Sorry, that I misspoke there. It's postmortem. So postmortem, you would have to have a brain biopsy in order to officially diagnose CTE because of the structural changes in the brain. So that's based on the structural changes in the brain. What we can identify, though, are functional changes in your day-to-day life. And so identifying from research what we do know about structural changes in the brain from CTE that was diagnosed, and also from you could call it a clinical cousin of Alzheimer's disease, because they are clinically similar in the structural abnormalities. They're just happening in different parts of the brain. And so you can identify then from the research that we do have and trying to identify real life application, then trying to bridge that gap and find those connections. And so I'm trying to think how I want to best explain this because I get really excited. So let me go back to what I said about the clinical cousin of Alzheimer's disease and why then I had this idea in my mind that CTE is a metabolic disorder. So the clinical cousin, I'm calling it a clinical cousin. I don't know if that's like a real way to explain it, but it's similar enough because it's the same structural abnormalities, just happening in different locations in the brain. So Alzheimer's is it's an abnormal accumulation of tau proteins, and they're accumulating between neurons. And so this accumulation over time can start to impact the blood flow and the actual metabolic processes of the cells and can end up killing off the cells. But it happens gradually because it's happening between neurons. And because it's happening, building up between neurons, you can see it on a scan. So Alzheimer's, the functional changes and the more cognitive changes, the things that you notice in your day-to-day life, it may be a slower progression of the disease. Cognitive function would be a slower regression. And it tends to take a more severe form later in life because it's just taking that much longer to build up. Now, that what I said, that abnormal accumulation of tau proteins, that's the same structural change that is happening in CTE that has been diagnosed post-mortem, but it's happening within a neuron. And so you still have this abnormal accumulation of tau proteins, but instead of it happening between neurons, it's within a neuron. So it can much more rapidly decrease and impact and interfere with blood flow, with metabolic activity of the cell, and with the overall life and functioning of the cell. So the cell can die off sooner and quicker, and there is less ability to identify it because it's happening within the neuron. So you can't just see it from a scan. And it's happening, like I said, quicker and can happen sooner. So these are at least some of the distinct distinctions and differences, but also similarities between these two. And so studying what we can in Alzheimer's and then looking at what we can in CTE, that is again diagnosed postmortem, trying to bridge that gap of the two. Now, something that I found to be fascinating, and that, like I said, it goes back to that thought I had that CTE is a metabolic disorder. So in Alzheimer's, the abnormal accumulation of tau proteins is closely linked to oxidative stress and neuroinflammation and basically like a metabolic dysfunction of the cell, that there's this increased accumulation of these tau proteins. And so because it's that same structural abnormality, we can apply the same concept to CTE, that there's this neuroinflammation, that there's this oxidative stress, and that there's this rapid accumulation of these proteins that are dysfunctioning, really. The metabolism of the cell is dysfunctioning. So Alzheimer's is also termed, it's also picked up a term along the way through research as type 3 diabetes, because Alzheimer's is linked to insulin resistance within the brain. So that metabolic impairment, like I said, it's a metabolic disorder. It's not a metabolic disorder like you would think with obesity or with type 2 diabetes, something that is happening peripherally within the body. It's metabolism within the brain. And this is an important distinction to, I think, highlight, and for us to really zero in on the fact that your brain metabolism is always occurring, regardless of the environment, regardless of what the conditions are within the brain. Your metabolism in the brain is constantly occurring. As long as there's brain activity, there's brain metabolism occurring. So that energy exchange, needing to have energy in order to continue the cell's functioning. And so having impaired metabolism within the brain, in this case, this insulin resistance within the brain, or type 3 diabetes being identified in Alzheimer's, I knew that there was something there with CTE as well, where there's some way this impaired metabolic, there's impaired metabolism, and there's, first of all, an increased metabolic rate in response to trauma. So trauma itself, actually, let me explain first. So the brain, if you want to think of the brain, is a very soft, spongy tissue. It is extremely sensitive, vulnerable, soft, spongy tissue, and it's floating in fluid. If you want to think of it like that, it's floating in fluid. It's not attached to anything besides being attached to the brain stem, but it is extremely soft and vulnerable. And any bit of trauma to it, so in this case, if we talk about trauma as being impact, like a collision or head injury, the brain has to stabilize itself from the inside. That's what it has to do. It doesn't have a way to lean against something, to grab against something. It doesn't have structure to it to absorb trauma. It has to stabilize itself from the inside. And so that's what's happening when there's trauma happening to the brain. The cells inside and what's happening within the cells, there's a very rapid increase in metabolic rate and a very rapid increase in energy production, because energy is being used very rapidly in order to very quickly try to stabilize. And so you get this accumulation, these proteins start to really rapidly unfold and cleave and then fold over again. And so it's almost like, if you can imagine this chaotic scene of all of a sudden trying to catch everything and clump it all together. That's probably not the greatest way to explain it, and catching everything, clump it all together. But so it's this concept of what is happening inside trying to stabilize itself with what it can. And so it's unfolding and folding and unfolding and folding these proteins to try to stabilize. So that could be why you have the abnormal accumulation of proteins inside the neurons, because there's this need to self-stabilize. That distinction, though, or really the similarity, though, between them, of this increased metabolic rate in response to trauma in order to stabilize itself. And then because there is this change, really damage to the cells, you are going to have damage to the cell function too. So when cells are damaged and their function is damaged, that's when you start to have that much more dysfunction in how they would operate in those normal properties. So that's when you start to have the more long-term chronic metabolic changes that are happening. So this is all stuff that I am absolutely dead set on following through on with my research, and this is probably going to be years worth of research. I'm hoping to get in with the brain bank so that way I can actually incorporate research with postmortem, with actual, CTE diagnosed brains. But then also, like I said, the big thing for me is real life application. So the reason why I gave that explanation there of the differences between those two, really the similarities and differences between those two, is because, like I said, when I said CTE is a metabolic disorder, so if we can understand that there's impaired metabolism occurring within a brain, that means that we actually have a little bit of advantage in now addressing lifestyle factors, different changes that could be made across lifestyle to help alleviate any distress, any oxidative stress, any imbalances. If there's excess of something that we don't want to have around, we at least have some nugget of information to work off of. So I think that's huge. But on top of that, and this is where I think it's well, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the impact of what changes in our lifestyle factors can mean to positively impact and support our brain health and potentially give us that many more years of longevity, that many more years of cognitive functioning, and really to help promote that stability of our mental health, of being able to function appropriately the way that we want to be functioning, and to have that stability really overall. Having that being able to identify the lifestyle factors gives us control in a situation that may otherwise feel like it's out of our control. And it can allow us to at least start to make decisions that we feel are in our best interest, knowing the outcome that we want for ourselves, the outcome that we are aiming for. We at least have that much more hope, really, and that much more direction on addressing these things. And so something that I want to really zero in on, if anything, because this topic is huge and I don't think it has been given the appropriate attention that it needs. And this is why. I think CTE as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, I think that is the most perfect name for this disease. But I think we have been a little too fixated on our definition of trauma. And what I mean by that, I think we have been fixated on trauma as being this acute physical impact, acute physical trauma, the acute physical damaging of something, in this case of the brain. And I think what we need to do is start to view the reality of what that word trauma can actually look like. Because trauma carries a much wider range of definitions, really. It can be defined in a wide range across people. Trauma can take place, it can take the form of a lot of different things for people, and especially when you look at then chronic trauma. What is chronic trauma for someone? And what could that look like for them over time? What are the things that are within their control and what are things that are not within their control? How much of it could have been a genetic predisposition? How much of it could have been lifestyle factors that maybe just a few decisions started early enough can build up and help to stabilize that trauma? And so this definition of trauma, really, trauma as a broader definition, you could think of it like this. It's a continued experience or continued damaging, a continuation of something that was at one point an experience or damaging or dysfunctional. But the trauma of it is what carries on. So the trauma of it is the continued aftermath of this event. And so different individuals may have varying levels or layers of trauma that they have experienced throughout their life in a variety of ways. And if we are fixated on trauma as being only traumatic if it is a physical impact, I think we then limit ourselves of understanding fully the full picture. And the reason why this is so important, a research study came out, I want to say a couple months ago. It wasn't too long ago. It was a recent research study that came out showing they looked at the brains of a bunch of individuals who had passed away before the age of 30 that were engaged in sports, specifically collision sports and contact sports. They wanted to look, this is a brain study on collision contact sports in really younger, if you want to call younger populations, or those who died before the age of 30. The top 2 causes of death in this population that their brains were donated to this brain bank for this research, the top 2 causes of death were suicide and unintentional drug overdose. So this is important to identify here, that under the age of 30, like I said, the top 2 causes of death, suicide and unintentional drug overdose. So that's number 1, escaping life, or wanting to escape the life that you're living, wanting to no longer have the life you're living. And 2, heavily numbing and escaping the life you're living. These are the top 2 causes of death in this population that is under 30 of collision, and it's primarily collision athletes. It's very largely men. There were a few women included in the study, but very largely men. Collision athletes who died of primarily, those were the top 2 causes of death before the age of 30. Now, here's the interesting thing. So this was a study in order to identify the prevalence of CTE in these brains. 40%, I want to say it was about 40% of these brains showed CTE in mild states. So it was a mild state of those structural changes of CTE, which I think is meaningful for a number of reasons. So what I'm going to say is this. That's meaningful to know that there are, so in this case, 40% of this population having these structural changes at even a moderate level. But I think what's more meaningful is the fact that that means that the other 60% didn't. They still were led down this road to an early death, what we would call an early death before the age of 30. Really due to, and again, these causes of death, like I said, are escaping reality or escaping the life you have, or trying to numb yourself away from the life you have. This is where I get that much more, I get very fired up on this topic, because there's something there. There's something there in the 40% that showed, like I said, it might have been mild to moderate, but I want to say off the top of my head that it was the mild conditions of CTE where it's that structural change. And that could be absolutely in response to collisions. But there's absolutely that much more of a factor of lifestyle changes, because the structural changes may or may not be there in everyone, but the end outcome across all of these individuals, despite the fact that they all had what was in common, that they all were collision sport athletes, that is meaningful. And that to me tells me that, like I said, CTE, I think is an appropriate it's an appropriate word for the condition itself, the diagnosis, but I think we've been a little too heavily fixated on first of all, the structural changes, but also the fact that trauma is only linked to collision, or that it's linked to specifically the acute physical collisions accumulating over time. I think what is actually meaningful is the fact that there is something happening chronically that is this traumatic continuation over time. Like I said, when I said that CT is a metabolic disorder, that would be this chronic change over time due to the trauma that was experienced. But in this case, because this population they showed mild symptoms, mild structural changes that were diagnostic for CTE. Whereas there's a very, anyone who's seen the very famous pictures of Aaron Hernandez, his brain, after he died, I want to say at the age of 27, when his brain was then donated after his death, after his suicide, and his brain showed structural changes that were equal to a much older individual, nowhere near what was expected for his age. So there's very clearly a difference here in the trauma that someone experiences on a chronic basis, and what those types of traumas, maybe predisposition to certain traumas, maybe a predisposition genetically to certain abnormalities, certain changes structurally, but there's certainly something there that is besides just playing the sport. I think playing the sport plays a key role. And I think maybe there are varying levels of trauma experienced in the sport that aren't specific to actual impacts, actual traumatic impacts, certainly not with specifically concussions. I think there is something else there with the lifestyle of the sport, with maybe the lifestyles of the individuals, why some individuals are more prone to structural changes than others. But there's absolutely 100% reason to believe that there is something there within the lifestyle, something there within chronic trauma across the lifestyle that is impacting the brains and how these brains are functioning. Because whether or not they had structural changes in their brains, they all ended up dying at an early age. This is why I get so fired up on this topic, because there is something there. There's something there that is not discussed. It's very silent. It's very much avoided. And I think that is only to our detriment to continue to put blinders on and to fixate on only something that we want to focus on. If we want solely to focus on concussions or on actual head-to-head contact, that gives us this feeling like we're doing something right. And it means that there's less accountability needed across the board for the other areas of life, the other forms of trauma that can be taking place, and especially the long-term chronic accumulation of trauma. I want to know if anyone for these studies, if anyone was really propositioned into looking at the backgrounds of these individuals to see, hey, the ones who had more structural damage than others, was there maybe something else going on? Maybe some way to identify other similarities and differences across these individuals? How many of those individuals grew up in unstable homes? How many of those individuals grew up with this constant conditioning, being told that they are only meant to be an athlete, that that's all that they are going to do, that's all they can do? And what happens when all these individuals that are raised in these conditions to believe that being an athlete is the end-all be-all, and then when their athletic career inevitably ends early, as it always does, then what happens? Where's their base of support? Like I said, the brain has to stabilize itself from within. And if all of these individuals grew up in these unstable conditions and they had to continually try to stabilize themselves from within, what could that actually do to how they function on a day-to-day basis? I get very motivated, if anything, talking about this topic, because it means that there's room to grow. First of all, that we're at least hopefully listening to this, that we're starting to ask questions, and that this is where I'm going to continue to really plow a lot of my research down this road of identifying these lifestyle factors and how lifestyle factors. So when I say lifestyle factors, that's not just your diet and exercise routine. I mean sleep, alcohol, other sources of well, I'll say addictions, but really just other sources of avenues where maybe there's an amount of distraction happening. Maybe there's an amount of a lack of rest and recovery and allowing for regeneration to happen. Maybe there is some sort of it could be something like a societal, social, economic stress that is constant. It's there all the time. It's impacting how you sleep. There are so many definitions of what is traumatic to someone. And I think we need to start really uncovering that from a higher degree of severity. We really need to take this seriously for the sake of everyone. And I want to leave this on one last final note, because I think this is probably the most pressing thing about that entire study was the fact that, I mean, of course it was in collision athletes, but the fact that it was primarily men and just a few women. And that's, of course, collision athletes. There's not that many female collision athletes. But I think the striking reality that this group of men who were collision athletes, who all had an untimely death before the age of 30, for reasons that, like I said, are primarily escaping life or numbing life. The reality is that statistically, men are more likely than women to actually commit suicide. Women are more likely than men statistically to express depressed symptoms or express suicidal thoughts, but men are more likely to take action. And this is where we need to be that much more cognizant. We need to be that much more intentional on the actions we take to protect these men and really just to protect anyone who feels like they don't have the ability or they've never been taught to express these types of feelings and sensations, these concerns that they have, these thoughts that they have. There's been a strong disconnect in communication, and instead this emphasis on action. And I think it's that much more important that we collectively decide to take action to help protect those who may only know how to take action on something and not ask for help, not reach out for help. So I want to leave on that note. I don't want this to be too depressing or serious of a topic, but I think it's necessary to take it as seriously as possible, because this is really the future. This is really, and it's not just the future, it's the present. And it's the necessary actions that we need to take presently, in present day, in order to move forward and make forward progress in this entire thing. So to wrap this entire story up, that was really, if anything, the types of conversations that I would have to have with these other dietitians about how to really prioritize appropriately. And it might mean that you deprioritize what you have been taught your entire life in order to reprioritize something that you can now identify as being that much more important. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.